morning, everyone. Thank you very much for taking your time out of your day to join our first PIMHS Fathers Forum. We're really delighted to get to this point. We're obviously, as an organisation, going through a bit of a evolution ourselves, so this feels like an important step in the right direction in terms of using our time and capacity to bring together the voices of fathers groups and to begin to shine a bit of a spotlight on the really critical work that you do. I'll start off by saying just a little bit about the kind of PIMHS journey, if that's okay, and to help you kind of understand our thinking in terms of how we can possibly play a role in shifting the kind of national thinking around perinatal and infant mental health and just family support in the early years. When we PIM and its former guise was Maternal Mental Health Scotland. So that was a coalition of essentially clinicians, a clinical forum, if you like, of people working in the perinatal space who came together outside of work to try and lobby for a bit more focus and attention around perinatal and infant mental health. Inevitably, the focus was quite narrow. It was about clinical specialist perinatal services for mums. And I'm really pleased to say that they've been around since 2011, so about 12 years. The landscape's obviously changed dramatically since then. We have, at that time in 2011, there was just one comprehensive perinatal mental health service in Scotland. We now, of course, have perinatal mental health services in all health board areas and infant mental health services developing across the country as well. So there's been quite a rapid expansion in terms of specialism, but that remains kind of clinical services for pregnant women. You know, there's obviously a huge amount of work to be done to shift the national thinking a bit. Actually, you know, what constitutes mental well-being as we transition to parenthood is much broader than, you know, a mum's kind of diagnosable condition. You know, it is about people in a context of relationships, and that's where people will thrive. And we need that much broader understanding of what mental health and well-being is. It isn't just about clinical need. It's about supporting families, providing that space to allow families to develop, to smoothly transition to parenthood and have that kind of resilience that's completely critical to allow them to be there and emotionally available for the children that are coming into the family. So I think that there is a kind of more of an understanding that it's much more holistic and complex than just a mum's kind of presenting mental ill health. We have to support families in the very earliest years. It's the most kind of fundamental window of opportunity to really transform outcomes for children, and that requires, you know, investing in parents and making sure that they're able to kind of support their children, as I say. So all of that thinking really informed our decision to move out of the kind of maternal mental health space and to try and be much more inclusive of all of those relationships that are so critical to well-being of a new family. And that's why we kind of moved away from maternal mental health. We're now Parent Infant Mental Health Scotland. And we hope that that kind of starts to help people think in a broader way, if you like, about all parental mental health and infant mental health, that we can in some way kind of start to push that narrative that it is much more ecological than how we've understood perinatal mental health currently. So that's what's behind the kind of changing approach and the name change. We're very much just at the start of the journey. We remain a completely tiny little resource, trying to do quite a lot of stuff, and arguably, you know, increasing our remit in this way means that we're spread a bit thinner. But it's a role, I think, is more about just trying to bring people together, harness the capacity in the system that exists, and maybe use some of the tools that we now have to promote the great work and shine a spotlight on what's happening elsewhere, and try and push this broader narrative with budget holders and decision makers. It's worth saying that we obviously were involved heavily in the campaigning for the funding for the perinatal mental health services that the Scottish Government pledged in 2019. That was £52 million, huge resource. 50 of that, I think approximately, roughly 50 of that, 50 million went into these clinical maternal services and expansion in NBU. 2.6 million or something was for the third sector. So it's a drop in the ocean, and it's really, we took that hard because we know that it was the voice of kind of lived experience that really drove the political pressure that eventually led to the Scottish Government finally investing in these services. So it's difficult, it's a difficult pill to swallow. We know that the third sector are responsible for stripping out the demand that there is for crisis intervention, for being in communities, for responding, identifying risk much earlier, being able to offer that kind of local community support. And yet, the critical role that they play wasn't sufficiently in any way kind of recognised in the way the government spent their money. So we want to change that, but in order to do that, we obviously need to speak with one strong collective voice. It's arguably clinical services, the NHS, have a louder voice, a stronger platform. We want to be working alongside the NHS, but bringing in all the relevant partners to make sure that we're adding weight to the arguments and helping people see that it isn't one part of the system's not going to be transformative. Families need a spectrum of care. They move in and out of difficulties at different times. We need to be flexible and responsive, and that their needs will change at different times, and that we all have a really critical role to play in that, and we therefore should all have parity in terms of how local budget holders are spending their money. So the role of PIMHS then, we hope, is to try and provide a bit of a platform and bring people together and maybe do some of the legwork in terms of developing kind of a strong collective voice and compelling messages that we can take to the government to kind of keep the pressure on them and make sure that they're adequately responding to every part of the system. I do think that there's, thanks to the work of the organisations here, and I know that you're doing a huge amount of work, there is much greater recognition of the role of fathers. At least, they have acknowledged and reflected the idea in policy terms, and know how disheartening that is when it's not translated into actually meaningful investment. But I think that that's a step in the right direction. So it's about kind of holding them to account on that and making sure that we're seeing some sort of translation of the war and words into actual investment and prioritisation. So I suppose that's what we hope to contribute to, and a first step in that is bringing people together, learning about what's out there, understanding what the challenges are, and then we may be able to help to shine a spotlight on those challenges and the kind of conversations that we're involved in through like the strategic board and other forums that we feed into. I don't know if I've missed anything major in terms of your evolution, Emma. Is that helpful, Stat?
That's fab. Yeah, no, that's what we were thinking. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
So I'm now to underline the point about the fab work. I'm now handing over to Kathy, who's going to talk about the great work that Fathers Network have been doing, particularly around the survey, I think. Is that right?
Thanks very much, Joanna. And Emma, thanks very much for inviting both myself and Thomas along to talk to you. And just to reiterate what Joanna was saying, I suppose from my perspective, and probably FNS's perspective, the issues around paternal mental health only became quite apparent probably back in 2017. So it's an issue that has gained quite a lot of awareness in recent times, but I think that we're kind of struggling to pick up the pace. I suppose that there's now far more research into the important roles that dads play during the perinatal period. And the struggles that they face with their mental health actually during that period as well. And I won't go into that in a moment. And we have a training course that's devoted entirely to that. So if you'd like to learn more, I can certainly pass on information about that at the end of the session. But today I'm going to talk about the dad survey. So every year we do an annual dad survey that goes out across Scotland to dads, and it's really to get a sense across the nation about how dads are doing, pick up on issues that they might be facing at home, in the workplace, with their mental health and their well-being, and the relationships that they have with their children and their partners. So it's been a bit of an evolution. Our dad we started doing our dad surveys back in 2017, and they've evolved year on year. But since the start of the pandemic in 2020, so the first lockdown in 2020, we've done a very similar dad survey every year. And so the findings that I'm going to provide you with today are really, it's giving you, hopefully it will stand on its own and provide you with some information about how dads are doing at the moment. And it's a very abridged version, so I've concentrated quite a lot of the slides on dads, particularly in the early years. So that first sort of 1,000 days. So it's giving you an idea of a snapshot just now and what's going on with dads' lives, but also we can kind of get a sense of how things are changing culturally over time. So without further ado, I will try and share my screen. And then with a little bit of luck, I'll turn this into a slideshow. There we go. Oops. Oh. And get back to the start. Okay, so just to provide you with a bit of context, as I said, the first dad survey in this series started in 2020 during lockdown. But what's really, really important is to understand what exactly has changed before lockdown and after lockdown. So it's really, really critical actually to kind of understand what happened during that period. So during the first lockdown, obviously, families came back together within the household. So everyone was sort of, unless you were a frontline service, you were kind of confined to barracks. So dads were coming back from their workplace and into the home. And we all got very well acquainted with Zoom and all these other kind of forms of video conferencing. And lots of people were working from home where certainly they weren't doing that beforehand. As a result, on average, fathers almost doubled the amount of time that they were spending with their children, supporting childcare in the house. So dads, the amount of time that dads were spending with their children went from 4 hours a day to 8 hours a day during that time period. So that was during the first lockdown. The time that mothers spent with their children rose from 7 to just over 10. So mums were doing more than dads, but the amount that dads were doing in the household increased dramatically, twofold. So I've already provided you with this little bit of context. So the most recent dad survey we've done is the 5th in this series. So we did our first during lockdown, the first lockdown. We did our second in March during the second national lockdown. We did another one in October, November 2021, and then a further one exactly this time of year. So May, June, collecting the data in 2022. So just to give you a kind of cast your minds back to what was happening in June, sort of May, June time when we were collecting this data. So we collected it over about a month. As we'll all know, the cost of living crisis is affecting us all. So we all feel like we've got less money to go out and do the shopping with, or everything, all the costs in the shops are going up. Fuel prices were rising markedly. Inflation was going through the roof. And this was a statement that was put out by the Scottish government around that time. So people across Scotland are being affected by the most severe economic crisis of the generation. The effects are now being seen in households and businesses, and households and businesses are having to make difficult choices despite the support announced. So this was the at the budget, and they were talking about the support they were giving to the most vulnerable families and people in our society. So as I said, we went out to dads during this point of crisis, really, within 2023, between May and June. And this is what we found out. So before I delve into what we found out, I'm just going to provide you with a little bit of context around who we spoke to. So first of all, we had a really astonishing response to our dad survey this year. So you'll see on the right-hand side the number of dads who got involved in our surveys over the time that we've been doing this series. Oops. So in lockdown 1, it was 284. Last year it was 271. So this year we jumped up to just over 1,000 dads, and I think that's made all the difference to us, because you're talking about a really large cohort of dads from right across Scotland. As you can see, most of the dads that we surveyed, the majority of them were between 35 and 44. This, to me, isn't particularly unusual, because the average age of a dad having his first child, I think, is around 33.6 years old nowadays. So actually having this kind of spike in the middle between 35 and 44 with a kind of tail off towards 65 is probably fairly indicative. We had dads participating from all of the health board areas across Scotland. There was a slight bias towards, again, the Central Belt. So we had more dads in Greater Glasgow and Clyde and the Lothians participating. I'm not sure about this, and maybe someone else in the room can talk a little bit about this, but I suspect there's probably more families in the Central Belt than there are in more rural areas of Scotland. So that might account for there being a greater number of dads participating against the average population. So I don't know, but we had certainly more urban dads than rural dads, but we had a complete spread across all of the health board areas. The education level of the dads, as you can see, most were either college or university or postgraduate degree level, so quite educated lot, I suppose, but again, quite a nice mix of dads with different educational backgrounds. We're quite pleased about this. Although we've got more dads from SIMD 5, which is the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, SIMD 1 is our communities from the most deprived communities, and SIMD 5 are the least deprived communities. So normally when you're asking for responses from a general population, you're likely to get more from SIMD 4 and SIMD 5 and less from SIMD 1 and SIMD 2. So given that usually it's a far greater bias, actually we're quite pleased with this spread. Again, quite a normal split. Most of the dads that we spoke to had either 1 or 2 children. And again, quite a nice split of the ages of dads. So if you count the dads who have children less than 1 and between 1 and 2, it's about 21%. So there's a nice even spread of dads from different age groups. And what's unusual with this group particularly are the 14% of dads who have children 18 or more, and it kind of slightly skewed our data actually. And you'll see later on that sometimes I've removed that because actually the children are not dependent although they may well be. By the eyes of the law, they're not seen as dependent children at that age. So sometimes I've stripped those dads out because they kind of slightly what's the word, bias things. Anyway, so just getting into the nitty-gritty of the findings. First of all, what we're finding is dads are putting their families first and discarding outdated social norms. How do we know that? Well, almost half of the dads, so 49% of the dads that we spoke to said that they were spending 25 hours or more per week playing or supporting their children's learning. As one dad said, my generation is different from my dad's and my grandparents. We are much more involved and often do the mainstay, but perceptions in society is that we don't, and it needs to be more accurate to life. So, as I said, COVID has changed things dramatically, I would say. And I don't know whether you can see this graph. So I'm looking particularly at the last set of kind of graphs on the right-hand side that says more than 25 hours. You'll see that during the first lockdown, there were 40% of dads who were spending 25 hours or more supporting their dads, playing with their children or supporting their learning. That went up to 44% during lockdown 2 when we asked dads. Incredibly, to me, I would say. Now that dads, apparently we've gone back to normal, and dads are going back into their places of work and so on and so forth. Despite all of these changes, 45% of dads, 45% of dads, the highest level we have ever recorded, are spending 25 hours or more playing or supporting their children's learning. To me, that's phenomenal. Now, if you take out that 14% of dads who were talking about supporting their children's learning with children over 18, actually the number gets up to 49. So that's almost half of all dads are spending a huge amount of time supporting their children's playing and learning. So they're there with their children. And to me, that's a phenomenal change from pre-COVID to this point now. And I think that I'm a complete cynic. And what I thought was going to happen is that we would go through lockdown. And then, as you'd see, so October, November 2021, there was this big drop off. My feeling was that that was going to continue, that we were going to see a return to normal. It's not the case, as far as I'm concerned, from what I'm seeing from the data that we're collecting. It's just not the case. Dads are increasingly involved in their children's lives. So, obviously, we're talking about the perinatal period, that first crucial 1,000 days. And so I wanted to just highlight who's doing the most. And I think actually this probably speaks to a change generationally, that dads with children, very young children, of course, they need to be more involved with their children's activities. But dads with children 2 and under are doing a lot of caring for their children, as you can see, and that number is increasing. So as you can see on the right hand side, during our survey exactly the same time of year last year, our survey found that 8 in 10 dads were spending 10 hours or more with their children in that group. That's risen to 9 in 10 dads are spending 10 or more hours per week with their children. So it's increasing a lot and quickly. And again, this is another thing that came out of the survey that I wasn't anticipating at all, but it's clear. And we saw this pattern last year, and again, it's been repeated this year. But dads from the most deprived areas, so that's SIMD1, are doing far more than other areas, particularly those from SIMD 5. So dads from the most deprived communities are spending the most time with their children. So 2 out of 3 dads in SIMD 1 are spending 25 hours or more with their children per week. So that's 17% higher than this time last year. So you can see that there's a dramatic change that's happening right now. So, and almost twice as much time as dads from most affluent areas. And to me, this presents a huge opportunity for services to get involved with dads, to include dads more, to support their children. There's just a golden opportunity at the moment, I think, for people to get dads involved and to support dads and to support their children learning in the home. But obviously, we started off by talking about the context in which we're living at the moment. So obviously, we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. It's affecting us all. It's definitely affecting dads, and they're telling us about it within the surveys. So dads are finding it difficult to strike a balance between being the provider, so providing financially for their families, and being there, caring for their children as they wanted to. So they went through COVID. They got involved in their children's learning. It really changed the relationship that they had with their children during that period. And many of those dads talked about their desire to stay connected with their children, to be there more in the future. And so dads feel this tension, this pull between wanting to provide financially for their families, but also not wanting to miss out on their children growing up. So what does this look like? So we asked dads about whether they feel satisfied with the amount of quality time that they're spending with their children. And sadly, a quarter of dads, a quarter of the 1,000 dads said that they were almost never satisfied with the amount of quality time they were spending with their child. So 76% of that entire figure, we asked them to sort of tell us a little bit more. And 76% took the time to tell us why this was the case. So I'm just going to go on and explain some of their answers about why they were dissatisfied. So again, coming back to cost of living, providing for the family, particularly during the cost of living crisis, means for some, work just has to take priority. Sometimes it's hard to pick my work over my children, but I have to prioritize work over my family so I can provide for them. So some dads are just going, I've just got to provide. I've just got to keep the roof over my family's heads. Lots of dads talked about conflicting demands. So the conflict between work and home commitments make it very difficult to focus or appreciate either. Often that sense of being betwixt and between was coupled with feelings of guilt and regret. So it's tricky to balance. It's a tricky balance to strike, and I rarely feel I get it right. Either I feel guilty about working or I feel guilty about spending time with my family. So, you know, there's just this, I got the sense as I was going through the data and analyzing this data, there's just this pull that dads feel in these two opposing directions and just not getting it right. And it just sort of comes across as you go through the data. It's really, you can really sense it. So these are just two examples of, you know, literally hundreds. But despite all of this, dads are continuing to prioritize their children. Over a quarter of dads, 27%, told us how they are prioritizing their children. And as one dad put it, family comes absolutely first. It can be a struggle at times. I try not to miss things that are important to my children. If it's important to them, it's important to me. It's really that simple. So I think that we're seeing the sea change of dads it's putting their children ahead of their career often, despite this pull in two different directions of wanting to provide and wanting to be there. And obviously, you know, trying to satisfy these impulses is taking its toll. Trying to be the perfect dad by providing and being there, this pressure is taking its toll. And so we asked dads this question, or we gave them the statement of, I work so hard that I don't have any time for myself. And we gave them these options of almost all the time, often, sometimes, and almost never. So you'll see that 10% of all these dads are saying that they work so hard that they never, almost never, have time for themselves. So as one dad puts it, it feels like a conveyor belt. Get up, log on, take daughter to school, log back on, work until dinner time, eat, fast, try to get daughter to bed, but too tired and frustrated to enjoy the time. Daughter doesn't want to sleep, so less time for ourselves at night, and then too tired to do anything except stare at the TV. And I'm sure that that's probably a sentiment that's felt by many, actually. So it was quite interesting looking at these dads in terms of the age of the children that they have. So you'll see that there's this really big spike with parents or dads who have their youngest child is between 1 and 2 years old. You'll see that in the graph on the left-hand side. 45% of this group found balancing work and family life difficult or very difficult, and that's compared to an average of 26%. So I think that probably what's happening at this point is that mum might have had time off maternity leave, dad might have had some paternity leave, although less likely, during the first year. And then once you get to the end of that first year and mum's going back to work, then all of a sudden there's this huge pressure actually on the whole family unit to try and juggle balancing a very small child and work between them as a family unit. So I think this is why we're seeing this kind of particular spike with children between 1 and 2. So as one dad says, my working hours means I'm unable to take my son to many groups, activities, etc., which are available during work days. There are some at weekends which I can take advantage of when I can summon up enough energy at the end of a working week. I try to finish work early some days to give us more time together. I need to make up the hours at other times, which can be difficult to fill in. So, to fit in. So you can kind of see that dads really, really want to be there, but sometimes just other things get in the way. But it absolutely is taking a toll. I've skipped one of our key findings because we just don't have enough time to go into it. But I thought probably what was most important for this group is to look at dads experiencing poor mental health. So it was quite interesting looking at the mental health data that came back, because actually, if you look at it on the face of it, it seems like dad's mental health is getting better, which is good news, actually. So you can see that there are improvements between June 2022 and June 2023. So some of the dads saying that their mental health is very good has gone up from 4% last year to 16% this year, which is great news. However, at the other extreme, so dads experiencing very poor mental health, that number has gone up from 6% last year to 11% this year. So almost double the number of dads in a year are telling us that their mental health is very poor. And I suppose that's the bit that really rings alarm bells to me. So there are far more dads this year that are telling us that their mental health is very poor. And I guess those are the dads particularly that this group will be seeing more of. And it looks like it's a twofold increase. The same is true if we look at optimism over how dads feel about the next 12 months. Again, actually, strangely to me, it seems that dads are more optimistic, or certainly in June they felt more optimistic than they did last year, apart from the bits at the edge. So the dads that felt very worried, there was 8% last year, 12% this year. So those are dads presumably that are maybe facing serious financial pressures, very worried about the state of the world, so on and so forth. So when we asked dads to tell us a bit more about why they thought their mental health had deteriorated, and we had 461 responses to that question. 2/3 of those 461 talked about issues with work, issues with money, and their ability to compete, to cope with these competing demands on their time. So you'll see those are the ones highlighted in darker colors. There are also other elements that I just don't have time to get into today, so I'll skirt over them. So 29 talked about work. Many told us about the pressures of work causing stress, anxiety, and burnout. 24% told us about the financial pressure they felt, particularly as a result of the cost of living crisis. And again, 1 in 5 dads talked about these competing demands on their time, often causing them to feel overwhelmed and exhausted. Often this is a combination between work and money. I thought that this group particularly be interested in this element, which is health. So many dads talked about their chronic mental health conditions that they struggled with day in and day out. However, so those dads talked about struggling to motivate myself, no energy, and constant low mood. And this is often linked to physical health as well. We, well, maybe we don't actually, probably this group doesn't, but we often think of mental health and physical health not being linked, but obviously, we're all part of the same body. And lots of dads talked about that a physical health problem was affecting their mental health. So this dad was recovering from a long-term injury. He wasn't able to exercise as he normally would. So he was becoming overweight, and it then affected his mental health and his sense of self. So you can kind of see how these things are linked with what dads are telling us. Dads also talked about their partner's mental health. Again, probably for this group in particular, I think this is probably quite a useful lens to look through. So dads, my wife suffered a mental health breakdown and it's affected me a lot. My wife has depression and social anxiety. This has an impact in every element of both my working and family life. So particularly in the perinatal period, the effects of mum's mental health can affect dad and therefore the entire family group. And I think there are quite a few quotes actually from dads who had infants saying this kind of thing, that their partners were struggling with poor mental health. It was affecting them, and therefore it was affecting the whole family. So you can kind of see it viscerally, actually, as you look at these quotes. So again, this will be no surprise. We know that the literature says that 1 in 10 dads suffers from mental health issues during the perinatal period, during the first 2 years. My sense is that is far higher, actually. And there was a longitudinal study that came out in Canada. A huge number of dads, I think it was something like 2,000, I think, a cohort of around 2,000. It was showing that number is actually nearer to 25% of dads. So we're, I think, seriously underestimating the number of dads who suffer from very poor mental health as they're going through that transition into fatherhood. But you can see it quite, I suppose our study shows that in stark relief. So that 27% of dads with children under 1 told us that their mental health was very poor. So 27% of dads, I'll just reiterate that, with children under 1 are telling us that their mental health is very poor. And that's just under 2.5 times the average. And as one dad said, my relationship hasn't been the same since the baby. My release mechanisms and coping strategies of seeing friends and exercise have stopped. I just can't do all the stuff my wife does. And I didn't experience the psychological changes like my wife. I'm just not the same guy, but I'm just the same guy, but I feel like half the one I was. So it gives you a sense of this transition and how difficult dads find that transition into fatherhood, and how then that might affect mum and the infant as well. So hopefully that gives you a kind of sense of the issues that dads with these very young babies are facing. We also find, again, probably no surprise, that dads from the most deprived areas are struggling with their mental health. So 25% of dads from SIND1 told us that their mental health was very poor, and that was over twice the average. And again, so you can see what dads have said: I'm tired and working harder, with any spare time spent either cleaning, parenting, or eating. There's not much space for breathing or figuring myself out. I feel depressed about the amount of time I work, and most of the money I earn goes towards household bills. Everything else seems to be going up in price. So you can really sense that that strain that parents are going through. I'm running a little bit over, so I'll quickly skip through this, I think. But just to say that the dads who told us that their mental health had deteriorated over the last 6 months, 90% of them have told us that they looked for or received some kind of support. Most of those dads, and this is fairly critical, have shared how they feel with their partner. So it's people that are closest to them that they're confiding in. So it's their partners or very close friends and families that they're confiding in the most. 30% spoke to their GP. 23% went to another professional. 13% looked for received support online through a helpline. And 10% received support from a mental health support group. So you can see that dads are reaching out. My concern is that as the pressure grows within families, and you might get tension between mum and dad or whoever those partnerships are, actually they will share less together. So they'll discuss their problems less, and maybe dad won't feel able to reach out to his partner or vice versa. So that's my concern, actually. And then you might see families breaking down, which is, of course, not good for anyone concerned, actually. The other issue, I'm almost at the end. Sorry.
We need to wrap up till our time, because there's just so much that
Sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. I appreciate it. I think it's important to allow you time to go through all of this, because everything's so incredibly relevant. But to allow for a second presentation, we'll need to wrap up soon, please.
Okay, I'll skip through this and just say what we can do to help. So these are the last 2 slides. So as dads, and I suppose this is my carrying call really, as dads become increasingly involved in their children's lives, it's crucial that both parents are treated equally as caregivers by services to ensure the best outcomes for children. So we're kind of urging everybody really to find ways to include and support dads within services. We're lagging behind a little bit, I would say, and I'm sure that Thomas can speak to this a little bit, but that's my ask of everybody, actually, is just to try and include dads more. And of course, in terms of perinatal mental health services, we just think that there isn't enough support generally for the services that are out there. There's certainly not enough support for dads around perinatal mental support. So really just to adequately fund these services, and dads to have a space within that funding. And I think that's it. Just to say there's more to this, and we're just about to do a big piece of press. Actually, Thomas and I were being interviewed the last couple of days about the findings that are part of this follow-on report, which will come out this Sunday, actually. So that's me. I'm sorry that I rabbited on for too long there.
Not at all, Kathy. I'm sure everybody will agree, just of the critical importance of exposing the realities for dads in this way, and providing an evidence base is just a massive step forward. I think really, really powerful stuff, and gives us something to, you know, to refer to in our conversations about where we need to be placing our priority, you know, if we really want to affect change. Hugely informative, and we could, I'm sure people have loads of reflections, loads of questions. I know I have, but I think that just given the time, it'd be really good to hear from Thomas. We may not have an opportunity for questions at the end, but I'm very happy to follow up with another date, because there's obviously a huge amount here that we can be exploring together. But for now, I'll hand over to Thomas, if that's okay.
Okay, I'll be really quick. I was kind of lost in what Kathy was saying as well, because my head just starts to go off in different directions and have lots of thoughts about it. And I don't think we can underestimate the importance of the Fathers Network survey, and I think it's a huge testament that we've had over 1,000 dads, and I think, you know, that's a great challenge for Kathy and the team next year to get even more responses from dads next year. But I think it's all connected, isn't it? And it's all kind of like, I was thinking about this as Kathy was speaking as well, about how as a charity, you know, we try to have good relationship with NHS and statutory services like social work, and how that's at times really time consuming and really tiring. And sometimes you feel like it's 2 steps forward and 5 steps backwards, but actually we have to do that because we know that, you know, the families are coming through the NHS, and the NHS are key to this. So it's really important. And I guess I was just going to talk briefly. I have got some slides, but I'm not going to do them because I've not got time, but that's fine. So we started a national peer support service for dads in Scotland a couple of years ago. We got a lofty sum of £6,000 from the Scottish Government to run a national service. And so we've got a bit more money now from the National Lottery for that, but we've been really surprised and really amazed at the uptake in the service. So we just called it PS Dads Rock. We had to call it something. I wanted to call it Dad's Army, but then the Ukraine war started, so that probably wasn't a great idea. But the idea was that we were going to offer peer support to new and expectant dads in Scotland. It's a national service, so it's either online or it's on the phone. And people always say it's hard to get men to volunteer for things. We went to our dad's WhatsApp group and we posted to say, we don't need much of your time, but we're looking for dads to support other dads. And we were quite lucky and amazed to get dads to step forward. So currently we've got 17 volunteers across Scotland. They're not just in the Central Belt. And we have got some mums and some women who are volunteers supporting dads as well. So anybody can refer into the service. I was just checking the stats as Kathy was speaking as well. So for September, October, November, so for 3 months, we've supported 20 dads. And the aim for a year, the target is to support 40 dads. So we've already supported in the last 9 months or whatever of this year, we've already supported more dads than we thought we would in the 12 months. So we've supported dads in the islands, in the Highlands, and we're getting quite a few rural dads. And I had a look at some of the feedback from some of the dads who have been supported with peer support. And again, it's not rocket science, is it? They're saying stuff like, it's really nice to know I'm not alone, and it's good to know that I'm not the only person thinking this and feeling this way. And it's good to be able to speak to someone, to vent some of my frustrations, and to be able to have a conversation with someone. So a lot of the stuff's really sort of quite simple, fundamental stuff. But if we're not there doing it, then who is doing it? And that is a concern of ours, that there's a lot of isolation for new families. Information on our website for making referrals to our peer support service, but I'll shut up just now because I'm aware of time. So there's just a few minutes for questions.
Thanks very much, Thomas. I really appreciate that. That's really helpful to hear just about the history of that and how you guys have got to this point. I didn't appreciate that was where it kind of stemmed from, and you were granted with 6K to make that work. In terms of your profile and you know, the recognition, the branding and everything. It's incredibly powerful. So it's a remarkable start, given that that's what you were had in the back pocket to make that stuff work. I think it's incredible, but a really good example of, and I think that's kind of typical of the perinatal space, that actually it has been just people who are recognising the huge gulf in services out there, and have just made the decision that they're going to push until we plug some gaps, and the success of that, you know, that driving force has been quite remarkable, and no doubt will positively impact families' outcomes. So it's a really critical thing, and a really critical window of opportunity. You know, parents are uniquely motivated to make positive change. You know, there's obviously babies are at a uniquely, you know, optimal opportunity for brain development. If we can get it right in those early years, then the impact that has across services, across outcomes is remarkable. Yet as a society, we don't act as if that is the case. We don't design our services that way, and we certainly don't resource them in that way. So great to hear about this. I would love, I'm sure people will have reflections on what they've heard this morning. So we don't have a lot of time, but I'll hand it over to you guys if there's any questions. Remarkably quiet.
I had a question, if that's okay, sorry. Just to ask about the kind of results coming from rural areas, and maybe dads that are looking for support in rural areas, and is there any particular issues that maybe they're experiencing that are different from maybe dads in the kind of more populated central belt?
That's a really interesting question. It's interesting. Probably Thomas might be able to talk about it in terms of the peer support or the contact with peer support up in Highlands and Islands. Interestingly, we've received very little funding for this work as well. I think that we got £6,000. So probably out of that £52 million pot, there's been 12 grand earmarked for dads, which is kind of, you know, speaks volumes as far as I'm concerned, but I'll say no more than that. But we've just piloted a project up in NHS Highlands, actually, working with dads and helping them define the support locally to them. And it's been, we've literally just finished the pilot last week. So, and we're just going through the results at the moment, but it's been really encouraging, actually. So for us, it was, we provided support through Zoom, and I suspect that's the same for you, Thomas. You're providing support through Zoom, and it's an incredibly useful tool, actually, to support dads in that way. So we're both doing things actually in rural locations, and through this new technology, which is making a huge difference, actually. I don't know whether you want to say anything more about that, Thomas.
Just to answer Annabelle's question, I would say yes and no, unfortunately, in that I think parents have the same challenges and the same pressures wherever you are. But yes, because, you know, there's absolutely a feeling of more sort of isolation, or less for me as a dad up somewhere up north or somewhere in one of the islands than there is in the central belt. But of course, in Scotland, as soon as you get out of Glasgow and Edinburgh, there's very little for dads. So yeah, I think the answer is yes and no. There's a lot of similarities, to be honest. You know, my experiences of people talk about isolation, and you can be isolated in Leith, the most densely populated part of Scotland, or up north.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. Just a very quick one from me, Kathy. I was really interested in the increase in terms of 11% of dads who described their mental health as very poor, and I wondered if there was any, you know, reads across against any other characteristics. You know, were you able to say where that 11% came from in terms of SMID status or area or anything like that? Was there any themes there, or is it you weren't interrogating it in that
probably
way?
Yeah, I mean, the idea, I suppose, with the dad survey is to do it quickly and get the results out really, really fast. So we did this survey in May, June time, and then released it in October. So we kind of worked on 1,000 dads. We went up from 250, and I looked through, there's a huge gap between 250 and 1,000. So trying to kind of assimilate all that information, something that makes sense, took quite a lot of time, actually. So we probably haven't drilled down in that way, but we could. If you've got any specific questions you'd like me to have a look at dads in particular areas, I mean, it's quite a big data set, actually, so we can probably look and get indicative kind of ideas around, you know, so is it dads in rural locations? Is it dads from SIND1, that kind of stuff? So we could probably have a little look at that data, actually, and cut it in that way and just see if there's anything. But we haven't done that kind of deep dive, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's good to know then. Let's have a think about that. What we might kind of seek to draw out of that would be really interesting. I think I'll reflect on that as well, Kathy.
Sure.
We're now at the end of the meeting, unfortunately. It's clear, I think we can safely say there's a need for a forum like this where we can start to explore the experiences of dads. I'm really pleased to just have some space to dedicate some time and headspace to actually thinking about what more we can do to be supporting dads. And as Kathy's kind of describing, for a long time, men have just suffered in silence. So if they are now speaking out and are unable to get the help that they need, that's a huge problem that we need to tackle collectively. So I hope that you are able to remain involved in the Fathers Forum. It would be fantastic to have your involvement. And also in terms of Parent and Infant Mental Health Scotland, we are by no means reflective in the way that we need to be. So if people are interested in being involved in board membership or in some other way, maybe a reference group or whatever is kind of deemed helpful, would very much welcome your involvement in trying to just genuinely be much more representative of what makes for a kind of thriving families and communities. So that's really what we're aiming for. So if you're interested in being involved in PIMHS in any way, then please do get in touch. But I very much look forward to the next Fathers Forum, because there's just a huge amount that I'm sure we could do together. Thank you very much for your time. I'll call it a day there, but I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks very much.